Alright, so let's talk about what the whole point of statistics is and why we're here. So to motivate this example, let's say that on your next job, you're tasked with the assignment of answering the question of what percentage of all Americans approves of how the president is currently doing. And so let's say that you're working for a news organization. And so if you're tasked with this assignment, this being a reputable news source, your boss doesn't want you to just Google it, because that'll be basically relying on other people's research, and it might not be accurate. So you don't want just a secondary source of information, you want to be able to answer this question yourself as accurately as possible. So how do you think you would go about answering the question of what percentage of all Americans approves the president?
Start a survey.
Okay, so responsive survey. So let's say that I'm playing the role of devil's advocate, your boss. And when I hear survey, it sounds like just a subset of all Americans that you care about. So let's say a survey is of like 100 people. Well, that doesn't sound like it's gonna be very accurate and reflect the true sentiment of all 300 million Americans. So let's say that this is not very accurate, but let's say that, or this is not very practical, but let's say that you have a directory containing the names and contact information of every single American. And me as your boss, wanting the most accurate answer, I'm expecting you to go through and contact every single American to ask, do you approve of the president or not? And record their answer and just establish that as a percentage of all Americans that approves of the president. So, what's your response to that? Of having to contact every single American?
So to be honest with you, I'm gonna start that with, what computer system are you using that, would be fast enough to do that without bogging it down and killing everyone? Number two.
Well, not only any computer system, you're expected to, you have the name and contact information, like say phone number, so you're expected to just call them up. So you don't even need a computer.
Awesome, some lists.
So the concept of that literally just blew my mind.
Yeah.
That's a really big, that's a lot of paper, regardless. It doesn't seem feasible that you would contact everyone to actually make that survey, because my understanding is to get some kind of realistic, poll or data that you have on survey, you're gonna use random samples and try to cover all of it, so you want a large group that you can sample from, you're not doing everyone.
Yeah, but I'm your, let's say that I'm your boss and I refuse to, so let's say I refuse to have any inaccuracy, because if you have even a large sample, you're gonna exclude a lot of opinions. And let's say that you have the potential to include every single opinion. Why not do that?
I mean, well, I'll just probably call like every governor of each state and be like, how does your state feel about it?
But we
And
just
I
have
just
too much
vote
people,
on
as
it.
we
There
say.
you go.
Yeah, but let's say that you don't trust the governor to reflect the actual will of the people. Then what?
Then I'll call like every mayor.
Okay. So what's holding you back from calling every single American if you had this directory to do so?
The amount of time it would take to cover that data.
Okay, good. So how much time do you think it would actually take? Let's say I give you 2 weeks, because I expect it to take some time.
I don't think you get past the letter A for last names with only 2 weeks.
Okay, good. So let's go ahead and get a feel for how long it would actually take. Let's do like a back of the envelope or front of the whiteboard calculation. It's a real rough calculation of how long it would actually take. So roughly how many million Americans are there?
You already said 330 million.
Okay, good. So let's say, nice round number, let's say 300 million, even though there's slightly more. So 300 million is 300 followed by 6 zeros. And then, how long do you think it would talk to each American and ask, how long do you approve the president? Keep in mind, you have to do a little bit of small talk, right? Ask about the kids and the dog.
So 3-minute phone call if they actually pick it up. Basically
Okay.
saying, hey, I'm, my name from this source, we're doing a random survey poll in question for, what you believe, and it's a yes or no statement, do you approve of the presidency and their actions right now for the US government? And you go past that, whether you get a yes, no, or maybe so.
Okay, so keep in mind, this is a very polarizing issue, right? So either they're gonna hang up on you or they're gonna talk your ear off. So, so the comment was, on average, maybe it'll take 3 minutes. You guys agree? Or do you think maybe a little longer or less?
I think less.
Less?
I think you're gonna get some talkers in
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe on average, 3 minutes sounds reasonable?
Yeah, can we get the age group?
Okay,
Like
okay.
older people may talk longer.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so let's say on average 3 minutes per call. So if you just multiply these two numbers, you're gonna get the total number of minutes. This is a huge number of minutes, so to get some grasp on it, let's convert this large number of minutes to days or years. So how many minutes in an hour?
60.
Yeah, 60. Hours in a day,
24.
yeah. Days in a year,
365.
365, yeah. Okay, so now if you do this arithmetic, you're gonna come up with the total number of years it'll take. So if you have a scientific calculator handy, go ahead and enter this in. So it'll be 300 million times 3, and divide by 60, divide by 24, divide by 365.
The answer?
Yeah, there you go.
I got 1,712.
So it's in years. So by this point, the answer doesn't even matter. And as infeasible as this is, the real answer actually takes longer than this, and why is that?
Because you have to add, correlate that data and produce it in a result.
Yeah, right, you have to not only get raw data, but you have to analyze that raw data. And then what else?
You have to sleep.
Yeah, very good. So these numbers assume that you're working 24 hours a day for 365 days a year for the entire 1,712 years, right? So this is actually, even though it's completely infeasible, it's actually an optimistic answer, and the real answer takes actually longer than this. Okay, so that said, if you were to try to poll or ask every single American whether they approve the president, that's completely infeasible. So I'm gonna basically summarize this situation. And so everybody that you want information about, we call that the population. So this is an official word in statistics. So this is everybody that you want data about. And let me summarize that in picture form. So in this example, our population was the US. So this is supposed to be a map of the US. Florida's really big. So in this example, the population is the US. It doesn't have to be the US. It's just everybody that you want information about. Could be the state of Florida, it could be this classroom, it could be the whole world. It's just, the population is just everybody you want information about. So we said it was infeasible to collect data for everyone in the population. So there's no way around it. We're gonna have to get a subset if we wanna somehow answer this question. So the subset, which is only a small portion of the population, we call the sample. So we wanna be able to somehow use this much smaller data set, the sample, and draw a conclusion about the population using that sample. And this is the whole point of statistics. So statistics, the mission of statistics is to make a conclusion about the population using one or more samples. So, since we mentioned how a sample is so pivotal in this idea of statistics and making a conclusion about the whole population, what do you think would make a good sample? And by good sample, we mean whatever results we get in the sample, we can trust that it's representative for the whole population, and we'll be able to draw an accurate conclusion for that population using this good sample. So what do you think makes a good sample?
In terms of politics, making sure you're not calling all red states versus all blue states, making sure that there's diversity in the states you're calling.
Okay, very good. So I'm gonna summarize what you said by saying we want a sample that's representative of the population.
So like you'll pick bigger, counties.
Okay, good. So we'll talk about that. So by representative of the population, we mean that whatever attribute we consider important in predicting whether somebody approves of a president should be in the same proportion in that sample as it is in the original population. So for example, if in terms of political party, I'm just making up numbers here, but let's say we have 43%, 42% Republican, and 41% Democrats, and let's say 11% independent, and the rest undecided, for example. Then we want the same proportion that's in the population to exist in the sample as well. And that's what we mean by representative from the population. And we want these same proportions not only for political party, but whatever attribute we think is important in determining whether somebody approves of the president. So let's go through some examples of that. So what other attributes do you think are important in making sure that these percentages are the same?
Age.
Yeah,
Gender.
age. So age, if there's a certain ratio, percentage of males to females in the population, there needs to be a similar proportion of male to female gender in the sample as well. And same thing for age, so age, gender.
Income level?
Okay, good, income level. Anything else? So lots of things, right? Education.
Their employment status,
What size?
their employment status.
Employment status, right? Anything else?
Your culture.
Okay, good. So lots of things, right? You can probably even think of more things. But each of these things needs to be representative of the population in the sample, meaning that whatever percentages you have a breakdown for each of these attributes needs to be the same in the population as it is in the sample. That's what we mean by the sample being representative of the population. But these are all the important attributes that we can think of. What if we go and do our due diligence and we collect a sample and we painstakingly make sure that it's representative of the population by making sure that all these attributes are represented with the same proportions in the population as in the sample. But then after we're done collecting our sample, we then do statistics to make a conclusion about the population using that sample we just collected. And then we're satisfied with ourselves that we did a good job. But then, let's say weeks go by, and then it's discovered in research or in the news that there's another attribute that was important in determining whether somebody approved the president that we didn't happen to think of when we collected our sample. Like, let's say, I'm just making this up, let's say the type of soda that they drank should have been accounted for, but wasn't. So what would happen?
It would invalidate your results.
Yeah, it would seem to not make the conclusion that you generated from your sample. It would make it not accurate for your population because your sample didn't take that important attribute into consideration. So now the big question is, can you ever come up with all the important attributes to make sure that they're represented in the same proportions in the population as in the sample? If it's not soda, then it's like what kind of shoes they wear,
Or they, elected a new speaker of the House.
Exactly.
Please. Regardless, you can use the data and the stats that you have from the previous one, and you just state a different one moving forward, and eventually you'll have a record of reflective traits that you can see. So the data is still good up to a point, but it is now changed due to circumstances or variables.
Okay, so the response was, you basically have a disclaimer that says that these results are only good as of this day. But what if you wanted to make a conclusion that was more truthful, more inherent, based on just not only on timely occurrences like what took place in the news that day, but based on human nature, based on
I'll use the institution, like a university.
what is it?
That's how I use like a university, like all the college students.
Okay, but what if your population is, let's say, the whole country? Can you use only college students to ask whether they approve the president? In that case, then education then is not going to be in the same is not going to be representative in that sample as in the population, because in education alone you have this mismatch. Right. So so the ongoing question is, we want to make sure all these attributes are representative of the population as they are in the sample that you collect. But the question is, what if there's some important attribute that you didn't take into account at the time of your sample? And the follow-up question is, can you ever account for all the important attributes to make sure that your sample is representative of the population? And if you can't account for those things, then theoretically, your sample is never representative of the population truly, and this whole business of statistics falls apart, and you're never able to accurately make a conclusion about the population using a sample because it's a bad sample to begin with. So any responses to that?
So for the first part of that question, take another sample. For the second part of that question, there's only so many things that you can account for, which is why you try to make it random to cover a representation of the population, and you make it large enough that your numbers still matter, even if you have an extra variable that shows up.
Okay, good. So there are a lot of things there, but let me get a.
You could just give a disclaimer of the variables you did use, and then if anybody thinks like, oh, well, you forgot this, then they would see the variables you used.
That's true. That absolves you from liability at some point.
Yeah.
But let's say that that's not your main goal, is to be absolved from liability. Let's say your main goal is to actually get a good answer for what percentage of the country actually approves of the president. So there's a good response here in that, let's make the sample random. So that's a very loaded term. So what does it mean to make a sample random?
Again, you said loaded term, I love that way that you described it, but it's trying to get something from everybody, not just, we're only taking votes or opinions out of Atlanta, Georgia, but now we're gonna try to randomly go across, based on, voting, criteria from the registration cards, and age and employment and education level, but they're trying to cover everybody on this to a certain amount or number that you have said would be a good representation for that sample, and then, quantify your data on paper.
Okay, very good. So let me summarize that. So basically, we want a random sample, and what random means is, imagine you have a piece of paper with everybody's name, all 300 million people in a hat, and you're just randomly drawing names without regard to where they live, where they're from, their education, employment status, any of that. You're just randomly, blindly drawing names out. So that's a simulation of what we mean by random. So anybody who ends up in that sample, you're giving them an equal opportunity to be part of that sample. So that's what we mean by a random sample. So if you have a sample that is random, then this issue that we talked about, where how can we be sure if we've accounted for all the possible attributes, that issue automatically takes care of itself. Because if you make a sample random, then all these attributes, as well as the ones that you haven't accounted for, will automatically be in the same proportion in the population as they are in the sample. So let's do an example. So let's say that you ask this question of what percentage of all Americans approves of the president, and in order to gather your sample, let's say what you do is you ask a radio show host to ask this question on the airways, and ask this question of, do you approve of the president, call in and voice your opinion. And so let's say the people who end up calling in constitute the sample. So the question is that a random sample?
No.
Okay, why?
It's not a random sample because you have the people who are opinionated about that question, giving their bias for an answer.
Okay, very good. So if a sample is truly random, it's not gonna have any biases. A bias means that anybody who ends up as part of your sample, you're biasing or favoring something about those people in some way, so that only they end up being part of your sample. So a random sample will not have any biases. But if you say that a sample is not random, we need to be prepared to identify one or more biases. So this example with the radio show callers, we said it was not random. And so let's identify as many biases as we can that makes it not random. So one bias that was mentioned was people who choose to call in the first place are opinionated, so they choose to call in. Our population that we care about, all 300 million Americans, there's gonna be people who aren't that opinionated, who wouldn't choose to call in, but their opinion is just as valid. So it's not random. One bias. So one bias is the people who call in are people who choose to call in the first place. So only people who choose to call in are part of your sample. So only people who choose to voice their opinion. this is actually a very important type of bias called volunteer bias.
I'm not trying to jump in the weeds on this one and ask a different question. What time is a show or a radio show going on? Because there are a lot of people who, based on their employment, who aren't gonna hear the radio, so they never have the opportunity to do it.
Very good. So, so the first bias, we call volunteer bias. And so the second, another bias might be, only people who are available at that time of day would be able to call in. So that excludes a lot of people who are working, a lot of people who are in school. So only people available at that time. Okay, any other biases you can think of?
It depends on the content of the radio show, and who's watching that particular show.
Okay, good. So only people who have interest in that particular content would choose to listen to that radio show and choose to call in. So only people interested in that show content. Good, anything else?
I wanna ask, cause I mean, is it only on that one station that this radio show is going across, or is it on multiple? Because that can.
This is a made up example, so let's say yes.
Okay, so it depends on what time it's being broadcast and to what group is listening. So that can, you can cover a couple more that way, but it's still not gonna get everybody due to sample two, or bias two, my apology.
Yeah, so let's say that this radio show is geared towards a certain type of listener, so it has certain content. So then, let's say that that applies to bias 3 here, so only people interested in listening to that particular content would be part of that audience. Anything else?
I think also the location.
Okay, very good, so let's say that it could be a national radio show, it could be a local radio show, but usually a radio show only has a broadcast range of a certain range. So only people in that vicinity would be able to listen to that broadcast. Okay. So there could be more, but that's a good enough exercise for now. So the point here was that this is not a random sample because it has at least one bias, and these are at least 4 biases that we can think of that make this sample not random. And because it's not random, any result that you get from the sample, you can't necessarily trust to reflect to be accurate for this whole population of all 300 million Americans. Okay, any questions? Okay, let's do another example. So every week there are results posted as to how many millions of Americans watch a certain TV show. And this turns out to be big business because it dictates how many millions of dollars goes into advertises for a certain TV spot. Or it decides on whether that TV show will end up being canceled or not because there's not enough viewers. So how do you think people determine how many millions of Americans watch a certain TV show?
So quite a few ways to look into that one. So one, it can be streamed on the internet. So what streaming service is being used in that particular time, the amount of times a show has been clicked and requested, number of views is a good way to look at that, which is data they can collect from all the streaming services or from primetime TV, which is the rated slots that you're talking about, and how much it is continuing to go, or if something else is drawing that attention. Right? And then a lot of the stuff has comments and feedbacks on it, so how much is going in a positive direction or a negative direction and why.
Sure, like there's some shows that are only streamed by a certain service, like only Netflix. Then in that case, Netflix has its own data and it can tell exactly how many viewers are watching that show. But what about other shows that are primetime shows on local public channels, for example? How do you think people determine how many millions of Americans watch their shows, like ABC or NBC?
I would use Netflix. Netflix is good at making sure you know which TV show is popular.
A lot of the streaming services have that, so before we had all those, we had, analog televisions with 3 channels, and sometimes a fourth one if you could get it to come in, right? So how do they know what to put on there? That's where he's basing this question at, and, whether it was Days of Our Lives or General Hospital, which one did they wanna actually watch for your soap opera during that, time block they had it on? They did the same thing with a lot of the game shows, and some of them would disappear and new ones would show up. And it was based on the amount of viewers or how much signal was being fed to those televisions for that channel on the strength of their bandwidth, and what assumed for the demographic on the time zones going across the nation and who was using it on how they produce those results. How that's gonna be actually recorded, it's either on power or how much bandwidth is actually having to be broadcast to feed that to everybody, so I don't know how they put that into place, but that is my
Okay.
assumption.
So you would think, on newer shows, the ones that only show up on Netflix, for example, or HBO Max, then they have their own way, because they're a private company, to look at their own internal data. But older shows that can be broadcast on multiple different channels, then you would think that the cable company might be able to just monitor what their customers watch and report that. It turns out that that's subject to FCC regulations, so that's not legal for the cable companies to report what their customers watch. So it turns out that there's a private company that handles that, and you might have heard of the Nielsen ratings. So Nielsen is a private company where they just knock on people's doors and they ask, well, we have this little black box that monitors everything that you watch. If we pay you some money, is it okay if we put the black box to your TV and monitor what you watch? And there's gonna be some households that say, yeah, that's okay. And there's about 20,000 of these households with these boxes. And these 20,000 boxes constitute a sample. And then so Nielsen then looks at the results of these 20,000 boxes and then makes a conclusion about what the whole country watches. So these 20,000 boxes that constitute the sample, do you think this represents a random sample?
No.
Okay, and when you say that it's not random, let's identify one or more biases.
Well, there's the voluntary bias because you have to volunteer to have the box installed on your TV.
Very good, so only people who volunteer to put the box on their TV is part of the sample.
Income being the second one.
Okay, good.
Yeah, which demographic of people are you targeting?
Okay, so the last comment was that income might be a factor because there's a monetary reward attached to this, is that maybe only people who see the reward as being an incentive enough for them to have their privacy violated would choose to do this. So only people who are incentivized by the monetary reward.
That is such a more positive way of looking at that.
Okay, what else?
So, um,
Age group.
it's definitely gonna be age group, cause I'm trying to say is like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that can't be seen or viewed due to children, so there could be, you know, locks or preventions to make sure certain things aren't seen without appropriate, supervision, let's put it that way.
Okay. So, so what age group is being skewed by people who choose to put these boxes on their TVs? Are you saying that there's an older group or a younger group, compared to the general population?
Yeah, cause like older people may be watching Lifetime.
Yeah, so maybe, because keep in mind that these people have to, agree to have their black boxes there, and they have to be home when people are knocking on their doors. So maybe, people who aren't working or going to school are the ones who end up responding, so maybe, there's a bias in terms of age. So only people home at that time. When door is knocked. What else?
I'm trying to put that one in my head the right way. So it's like, availability of, program viewing, I think is more along the lines because employment status and income kind of tie into that, like where are they at and can they watch what they're trying to survey for?
Okay, good. So, only people who have these black boxes, who are home at certain times, are able to be part of this survey, and if they're home at certain times, then they'll watch one show at a certain time versus another show that's not at a convenient time. Any other comments?
Just location of what neighborhoods they're asking, the people if they wanna put the box in.
Okay, so maybe only neighborhoods who are near this Nielsen company,
Right.
where they're able to visit the neighborhood. Okay, very good. So the point is that this is not a random sample because you have at least one bias. At this point, you might be thinking, it seems like this volunteer bias is showing up a lot, and it makes sense because you have to have consent from the person for them to be in the sample in the first place. So you might be thinking, well, isn't there volunteer bias anytime you have a sample? So you would think so. And so if there's volunteer bias, every time you do a sample, so you would have a sample that's not truly random. So the question is, can you ever have a truly random sample? Knowing that this volunteer bias is a practical, legal thing that should be there. Okay, so let's talk about an example, or some examples of samples that don't have volunteer bias.
Okay. Obituaries?
Well, it depends on what your population is, right? But if your population is all living people, then not necessarily. Okay, let's do an example from Facebook. So years ago, Facebook came under great fire for manipulating their users. I don't know if you guys read about this in the news. But Facebook is an online social network. There's always somebody in the class who chooses to live off the grid, and I respect that. So we're gonna talk briefly what Facebook is, in case you don't know. And so Facebook is an online social network where you post ongoings of your life. Pictures, status updates, videos, and so forth. And you post them to other people who are in your social network, your friends and family members. So as a social network, Facebook is distinct in that it has something called a newsfeed. So a newsfeed is, it has the ongoings of all the main people in your social network on one page, so that you can just look at it at a glance. So what Facebook ended up doing is that on people's news feeds, they ended up cherry picking only things that, for example, were positive news for one user, and for another user, they would pick only things that were negative news from their friends. And they wanted to see whether there was an influence in how the user would react in terms of what they would post in turn. So for example, if you as a user saw only good news, would you in turn begin a good news and post happy things on your status? Or vice versa, if you saw only bad news from your friends, would you in turn be in a bad mood and post only negative, depressing things on your status? So, Facebook did this without telling any of their users. They did this to several thousands of their users randomly, without any consent from their users. So they did this so that they could avoid having this volunteer bias. And so anybody who ended up part of this random sample was truly random because their users didn't have a say on whether they wanted to be part of it or not. Any questions, comments? So while we're talking about this, what do you think the results were? What do you think the conclusion was? If you see only happy news or only sad news, does that affect your mood?
Yes.
Yeah, certainly. So, and by by Facebook having that conclusion, that's great for Facebook because now they know that they can manipulate their users by influencing their buying habits or their habits when they're on Facebook. Any questions, comments? Okay, so Facebook was able to do this because it was legal. So whether it's ethical or not, that's a different question. Likely not ethical. But why was it legal for Facebook to do?
You have to volunteer to sign up to create an account with Facebook.
Yeah, very good.
And
So
there's certain like terms and conditions you have to agree to in order to have that account.
yeah, very good. So anybody who uses Facebook, there's a 300-page end user license agreement that nobody reads. And by signing it, you're volunteering already to this kind of thing. Any comments, questions? Okay, so that's one example of a real life sample that doesn't have volunteer bias because it's trying to be as random as possible. So let's look at one more example. And this is another example from online. This is a website called OkCupid. So OkCupid is a dating website. So it's like Match.com. It's similar. Basically, you create a online dating profile to find suitable dates, and the website presents you with potential matches, the picture of the person, their interests, and also the website gives you what it predicts would be a compatibility score between you and that person. So, OkCupid, months after the whole Facebook controversy came out, OkCupid also came out and said, okay, we gotta admit, for months, we've been making up the compatibility score just to see what would happen. So what that means is, if you're shown the profile of somebody who's a potential date, they could be a 17% match, but the website is saying you're a 99% match, just to see if you're more likely to reach out and message the person. And again, they did this without telling anybody so that they could have a sample that didn't have any volunteer bias. So while we're talking about it, what do you think the results were? So if the compatibility score is high, you're more likely to reach out to the person. Yeah, you would think so, but it turns out, based on doing the study, they concluded that there was no effect. So the compatibility score really doesn't matter. So what do you think matters?
Real chemistry. Alright.
Does that even matter?
No, so, main things that would probably matter there is, appearance, that they perceive and like each other by their physical appearance on their posted profile, like interest and hobbies, and personalities.
Yeah, so it turns out from the study that all that doesn't even matter. So what matters is just the picture itself, and that's why you have this onslaught of this onslaught of these new websites like Tinder, who basically only have the picture because they concluded that that's all that users care about. So for better or worse, because of that conclusion, that's what we had. Any questions, comments? And then, so the point is that these are examples of random samples in real life. Okay, so that's it for today, guys. Go ahead and sign on to do the homework. Homework is assigned already, but it's not due tomorrow, like normally it would be, because it's the first class. So make sure that you get signed up for homework. Homework won't be due until Wednesday.
When they come on my questions, make more sense, and that's not because I wanted to, I need an example.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, nice to meet you.
You're welcome, likewise.